This is Brian Kemple of Continuum Philosophical Insight, and today I'm going to begin working through a presentation that I gave in March of 2019 at Aquinas College in Grand Rapids, Michigan, on artificial intelligence and concept formation, an inquiry into being human in the age of robots. And so rather than simply read through the presentation as I did at college, I'm going to read through it and sort of expound on any points that I maybe left a little shorter in the presentation itself. And rather than doing this whole presentation in one go, I'm going to break it up into a couple of different segments, maybe 2 or 3 segments, sort of depending on how it goes. I'm just going to feel it out bit by bit as I proceed through. So to begin with, I want to start by telling you what this presentation is not about, and for that matter, what I myself am not. That is, I'm not an expert in artificial intelligence, robotics, engineering, computer science, and I'm not going to be saying a whole lot, really anything, about how artificial intelligence actually works. That is, anything about the nitty-gritty technical mechanisms. For one thing, I think it's kind of a dry subject, and for another, I don't really understand it that well myself in terms of how one part fits together with another. So while I do have a bit of computer programming in my background, it's so far in my background now, and not likely to get any closer, that I don't think I'm really the best person to speak in that regard. At least not these days. That said, I do have, I think, a relative set of insights, namely the insights of a philosopher well-versed in the Western traditions of scholasticism, semiotics, and phenomenology, and insights, that is, into the question of intelligence, and especially the question of human intelligence. Moreover, as a research fellow with the Center for the Study of Digital Life for the past few years, I have encountered, mostly digitally, many bright people presenting illuminating ideas about the nature of artificial intelligence, and I will be incorporating the results or takeaways or developments of those encounters into what I'm here to say today. Or to put this another way, I'm not very concerned with how artificial intelligence is being technologically pursued. With the achievements of artificial neural networks or quantum computing or parallel processing, neuromorphic chip developments, or even very much with those sorts of dystopian science fiction fears in which the robots will slaughter or enslave us all. Rather, I am much more concerned with what we really mean by the phrase artificial intelligence, as well as its closely related terms. And I am much more concerned even than that with how certain misunderstandings about artificial intelligence are feeding into centuries-long misunderstandings about what it means to be human, both in the sense of what is a human being, and in the sense of how should we live as human beings. That is, I think there's a pretty strong tendency these days to think about human thinking in the way that we think about computer processing. And I think this is a grave, grave mistake, because while there certainly are some parallels, and it's certainly the case that we develop computers to process in a way which is helpful or conducive to our own intellectual proceeding, it's a very big mistake to read backwards into that. I think we really, really misunderstand the functioning of our own intelligence by trying to understand it through the functioning of artificial intelligence. So, by way of beginning the presentation proper, I think we need to ask, what is intelligence? Now, if you look the word up in a dictionary, you're going to find one or another vague and unhelpful definition, as, for example, quote, the ability to learn or understand or deal with new and trying situations, or the ability to apply knowledge to manipulate one's environment or to think abstractly as measured by objective criteria, such as tests. Now, I say these definitions are unhelpful, for one, because they require definitions of learning, understanding, or knowledge, thinking, abstract, and don't get me started on objective criteria. And if you've paid attention to the 15-minute insights that I've put out, the one on the meaning of the word objective should be sort of at least provisionally illuminating for why I think that phrase is so horribly wrong and horribly unsuited to evaluating or discussing what intelligence is in any way. I think it's a good indicator of why I think that. For the other, I say that these definitions are vague because really between the two of them, the only distinguishing marks are manipulating one's environment, which is an act common to every living being, and thinking abstractly, which, what does that really mean to say that we think abstractly? Depending upon who you ask, living or dead, you could get any number of examples. You're going to get a different answer, from a Pythagorean than you will from a Thomist, or from a Cartesian, or a Kantian, or a 21st century analytic philosopher. So I don't know that either of these definitions really tell us a whole lot about intelligence that we wouldn't know already just from sort of common usage. I'm not sure that the definitions really specify us towards some better understanding than is commonly had in the first place. So now, I'm not trying to bash the contributors to and editors of the dictionary. Rather, I'm trying to point out that the meaning of the word intelligence is not something which is easy to grasp. And being difficult to grasp, it is even more difficult to convey, most especially in a society where there are countless presuppositions as to what intelligence is, or what it means, or how it is exhibited. That is, everyone has some vague and almost intuitive grasp on what intelligence means, since everyone has it him or herself, and so nearly no one stops to question what the term actually means, or what it is that we have that we're specifically indicating by the term intelligence. If you ask almost anyone what it means to be intelligent, and they're probably going to be able to give you some sorts of examples, right? They'll talk about something like the IQ test, or mathematical ability, or the ability to read a room, to read a situation, to profit either financially or, societally in some way. Intelligence clearly has something to do with how we understand things around us and are able to understand. Particularly, I think today, people understand it in terms of how we can understand to change things, or how things might change, how they might develop over time, or become otherwise than they are or have been. Innovation certainly seems to play a role in how many people today conceive of intelligence. And even people who are not educated, right, will have an opinion on intelligence, and almost certainly an opinion on their own intelligence. Some will either have, typically it seems like a greatly overstated opinion of their own intelligence, or they'll be very humble about it. And there's, a few people certainly who are between, but most people seem to prefer insisting that they're one or the other. So that is, to get back to the point here, I don't think we can look to a common reference source, whether that's the dictionary or Wikipedia or simply common usage, to find a really compelling understanding of what the term intelligence signifies. Rather, I think we have to make an examination anew. And we can do this by considering the things that we say have intelligence, namely animals, human beings, and in an as yet obscured way, robots or computer programs. That is, we want to see both what is common to these three kinds of supposed intelligence and what is different. And by seeing what is different, we can then, conversely, understand the misunderstandings about human and artificial intelligences. So, to get into this, let's consider animal intelligence. And as a brief aside, the title of this presentation is a bit of an homage to my late dissertation director, John Dealey, who in 1971 published an article in The Thomist, I believe, titled Animal Intelligence and Concept Formation. And it's a remarkable article. It's a very good article. It's a very informative article. It shows an awful lot of the sort of misunderstandings that seemed to be common among Thomists at the time about animal intelligence, and helps us to better understand our own intelligence in the process. So, animal intelligence here, I'm taking a lot from John Dealey, and even though I'm not getting into it nearly as deep as he did, a lot of my thinking is certainly deeply, strongly, profoundly influenced by Dr. Dealey. So, considering animal intelligence, I think some people, depending upon your qualifications, your background, and your understanding, this might seem like a kind of unbearable overgeneralization. After all, the differences between animals are not minor, and the lines between plant and animal life, to paint broadly, are not always easily drawn. So can we really say something about what constitutes the intelligence of all animals? Yes, I think we can, but if and only if we can distinguish what makes something an animal in the first place. And this is perhaps not as easy as it might seem to some. For the question, what distinguishes animals from plants? It's an old question. It's at least as old as Aristotle, that is, at least as old as the 4th century BC, if not, in fact, older. For Aristotle, the answer was succinctly put, that plants neither move themselves, nor do they have sensory powers. In the past 3 centuries, roughly speaking, the answer has been revealed as a little bit more complicated. That is, plants do seem to have a kind of sensory capacity. That is to say that they are able to receive a stimulus and respond to it in some way, and thus they seem to also, at least some of them, move themselves, albeit only ever in response to some directly present stimulus, which response to a directly present stimulus reinforces the notion that they have a kind of sensory capacity. And this is a distinction that I've been trying to develop in the last year or so, of a distinction between sensation, properly speaking, that is, sensation as something conducted through exterior sense powers, or sort of exterior receptors, and perception. And perception involves something more complex. It involves some sort of interpretive capacity. And this is precisely what plants do not seem to have, is this capacity to interpret any meaning out of the things that they sense. Rather, they react always and in all cases strictly according to whatever, I guess, quasi-interpretive structures they have genetically inherited. That is, there's a kind of genetic inheritance of a code through which all things are interpreted by plants. Which isn't to say that the inheritance is infallible and that there's never any, mistakes in the way that a plant conducts itself, or the way the plant is structured so as to interpret these things, sort of quasi-interpret. But I think it's at this level that we really see the illuminative contrast between plants and animals, which animals in even their lowliest forms may evaluate the objects they sense as being beneficial to themselves, harmful to themselves, or neutral. And I think this has been documented, and I could be wrong here. I'm not super up-to-date on all of the scientific literature. I'm certainly not an expert. But I think this has been documented even with starfish, which possess only 2 sense faculties. Faculty of touch and the barest, meagerest of photosensitivities. That is, they can perceive light only according to magnitude and not according to any variation in color or wavelength. But I think even the starfish has been documented as seeming to learn how to interpret its sensed objects. that is adjusting its behavior over time with repeated instances in reference to some objects which are exterior to themselves. Thus, while there might occur a kind of pseudo-learning in plants by the reshaping of genetic inheritances through evolutionary selection, this does not seem to occur in any individual plants, whereas it does occur in individual animals. And I'm sure some people will dispute this, and I'm always willing to entertain dialogue on this, and especially if you have good, relevant scientific literature. Because, as I said, I'm not an expert, right? This is not my field. But this is based on what I have read in the past and based on what I've been told by others. Now, it's also, to be perfectly clear, undoubted that there are confusing liminal appearing cases. Those where we cannot tell if what we are observing is the behavior which belongs to an animal or a plant. But these are exceptions to the norm, and the exceptions do not efface the distinction between the two, just as the shades of cyan or teal do not erase the colors of blue or green, but result somehow or another from their admixture. The difficulty we have in distinguishing whether some being is more properly a plant or an animal does not mean that there is no difference, but only that each term, plant and animal, covers a range of possibilities, and that there are a potentially infinite number of steps between the two. Now, this capacity of animals to interpret engages them in what I have come to call the context of referential meaning. In other words, objects sensed by animals are assigned meanings insofar as those objects can be referred to the animal itself. That is to say, the animals not only sense, but they perceive. They not only have a reception of the sensible qualities of a thing, but they have a reception of what Aristotle called incidental sensibles, or what we could call perceptual judgment evaluation. And the more objects the animal can perceive and thus evaluate, the more complex becomes its interior life. Thus, we observe more highly evolved animals experiencing intense feelings, which are in many ways seemingly comparable to our own. We see them having and developing accurate memories. We see them enacting intricate plans for manipulating their environment and even for manipulating and deceiving one another. Animals exhibit, therefore, what we can call a kind of particular reasoning, which is to say that they possess various perceptual faculties which enable operations. And these operations are those through which they interpretively conduct their own lives. That is, through these faculties, animals form percepts, or perceptual cognitive lenses, as it were, through which objects are interpreted as having referential meaning. These percepts are malleable and can change over time, with various causes precipitating reassessment. As a desirable food, for instance, one which smells and tastes good, may nevertheless become an object perceived through a lens of aversion, if it causes one to become sick, especially repeatedly. And the point here of describing these as lenses, these percepts as lenses, is that all too often we think of thoughts or anything having to do with thoughts, anything that we would say is within the mind, as being something which we understand directly, right? That it's something that we see, right? And through seeing it, we then compare it to the thing outside of ourselves, that we compare it to the reality from which it was derived. But this isn't really the way that I want to present it. It's not the way that I think Aristotle presents it. It's certainly not the way that Thomas Aquinas or faithful adherents of Thomas Aquinas' school, good Thomists, would present it. It's not the way that a good phenomenologist would present it, and it's not the way that a good semiotician would present it either. But rather, all things that we would characterize as thoughts, particularly percepts and, as we'll see momentarily, concepts, are much better described as signs. Right? Signs are, I think, the image of lenses helps us a little bit because we don't look at lenses typically, we look through lenses. Lenses are means to make an image appear before us in some way. We shouldn't take that metaphor too literally, but it is, I think, a helpful one to understand how we perceive things. I think in some ways it's actually more helpful with understanding perception than it is with understanding intellection, because we see how experiences through which we shape our percepts can become very distortive. I think that's much easier to see with a percept than with a concept. Any sort of traumatic incident or abuse or bad experience, we see how that maybe makes us misperceive things pretty readily. I always think of something like my dog, the last dog that I had. He was, he was a lovely, sweet dog, but he was a pound rescue dog, and there were two things that he had a sort of fear of when we first got him. And one was our garage. It was a cold concrete floor. It's a garage. It's not exactly welcoming and friendly, but it clearly seemed to remind the dog of some past trauma. And he also had a kind of fear being around my mother when he was alone with her. Initially, he got over that pretty quickly. But that's probably has to do with his having, presumably, I think the shelter let the person who got the dog know that it was a woman who had dropped him off. Quite possibly she was abusive. And so you see how this percept was formed for the dog through which the dog interpreted objects that were similar to that percept which had been formed. Now, to the precise number and function and interrelations of the faculties which form these percepts and perform these operations is a very complex topic and one which stands open to a lot of debate. Now, presently within the discipline of psychology, many of these operations that we would ascribe to the perceptual faculties are contained under the umbrella term of executive function. But in an older tradition, which myself and some others are attempting to revive, namely the Thomistic tradition, in order to provide all the sciences with a more fully developed conceptual apparatus for analyzing all animal behavior, including human, there are three primary perceptual faculties, or three genera of perceptual faculties. These were, for Thomas Aquinas, the imagination, the memory, and the cogitative faculty. But those terms can be a little confusing for some, the historical connotations which have accrued to the terminology. And so I've preferred to call them, in recent years at least, the simple retention, the pattern or recollective retention, and continuing with the use of the term cogitative faculty. And as a little bit of an aside, in non-human animals, the cogitative faculty isn't actually called the cogitative faculty. It's referred to as the estimative, because the sort of species, specifically human function, of cognitively processing objects considered within a sphere of referential meaning is elevated through the association with the intellect. There's something distinctly different about the way we cogitate as opposed to the way that other animals estimate. And so it's not the most important distinction for a sort of provisional introduction like this, but it is a pretty important one in terms of clearly distinguishing the differences between animal intelligence and human intelligence. That is, while the faculty in both humans and animals operates very similarly, there are very, very important differences. And so, at any rate, what's important to note about all these faculties and their various operations is that the faculties are of themselves undetermined as to the particular shapes which their operations take. That is, they may perform these operations in a wide variety of ways, which is to say that percepts can take many different forms. However, animals tend towards performing their operations in usual patterns, which is to say that our faculties develop habits, which we may consider as enduring context-specific modes of operating. In other words, to have a habit is to ordinarily do so-and-so and in such-and-such situation, as a consequence of entrenched percepts through which we interpret the objects in those situations. Now, some habits are largely somatic, such that little interpretation is required, as in the famous case of Pavlov's dogs. But others are more richly interactive, such as in mating rituals, birds' nest constructions, food gathering or hunting, beavers' dam building, or the interactions between domesticated pets and their owners. For all animals, including humans, these habits are formed through a complex network of causes. That is, they are caused not only by the kinds of faculties we have, or the organs we possess, but the dispositions of these organs, the objects by which and the objects towards which the faculties are ordered, by the cathectic response mechanisms, that is, feelings and emotions, using the word cathectic in an expanded and less specific sense than Freud did, to refer really to our feelings and emotions, which emerge as a response to those objects, as well as by a host of circumstances which are far too numerous to mention here. Now, this network of complex causality results not only in relatively ordinary habits, like wanting coffee in the morning when we wake up, or a cigarette after a meal, or a walk in the evening, or going to the gym 3 times a week, but also in those strange idiosyncratic ones, whether these be the odd affectations of our professors, or bizarre compulsions at inopportune moments, sexual paraphilias and fetishes, and so on. Which is not to say that these oddities all occur in the same manner, or that they can be explained away simply. Just the opposite, in fact. Really what we're trying to indicate here is that while we can identify most of these issues as matters of habit, right, and they're things that have been entrenched in us in a certain way, either through odd occurrences, strange, profoundly impactful occurrences, especially in youth, or they have been gradually built up in some way. I think particularly that's common with a lot of sexual paraphilias. This you can't just identify, even though we can say that, okay, well, this person has this because it's a habit, right, and because it's become habitual for them. The formation of that habit is usually very complicated. Something like even a sort of innocuous one, right? A professor's perhaps odd affectation, or I have certain habits that I seem to have picked up from my father without ever really having any idea why or how. He would put his arm against the window when he drove quite often, and put his index and middle finger against the top of the window. And one day I caught myself doing the same thing. It was weird. Like, is there a genetic part of that? Is that somehow something that I observed and developed as a habit? I don't really know. So it's most of our habits are very complex in their origins. And so really what we're trying to say here is that a sort of insufficient attention to the nuances of our perceptual faculties and their resultant cathectic mechanisms, I think results in a pretty poorly constructed, or maybe even outright evacuated conception of animal psychology, and therefore of our grasp is on what is meant by animal intelligence, and in a broader sense by intelligence in general. For ultimately, I think what we see in non-human animals is that their quote-unquote particular reason, as Aquinas would call it, is ordered towards solving problems that have appeared within the context of referential meaning. That is, they have both by innate genetic inheritance and by habituated interpretational experience formed a variety of desires which they seek to fulfill. And this fulfillment requires the overcoming of obstacles, and it's that overcoming of obstacles towards which they bend their intelligence. So I'm going to bring it to a close for this recording. I'm only through the first section out of 4, and then a conclusion of the paper. But I wanted to sort of keep it to about half an hour, and I'm just over half an hour now. I think, though, it's pretty crucial to get clear on what we mean by animal intelligence and what it means to say that an animal has intelligence. For large part because, as we'll see in the beginning of the next section, there has been a tendency to elide the differences between human and animal intelligence in the past several centuries. That we think of the difference as one which is only of degree and not of kind, as though there's nothing unique about human intelligence or what human intelligence does compared to animals. But when we evaluate animals and their behavior, certainly they do a lot of the same things that we do. And that's conducted through their estimative power, which is central to their lives, just as our cogitative power is central to our own. But we'll have to dig a bit deeper into what happens in our own cogitative operations in order to discern the distinguishing mark of species-specifically human intelligence. And that will allow us to see what's going on with artificial intelligence and what I've called the sort of hidden dangers of AI. So thank you for listening. Thank you for subscribing. And check out my new Patreon page if you feel like contributing to my well-being.